Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the U.S. Defiance and watched the stars through the main screen. The ship moved silently through space like a ghost hunting for revenge. 3 months had passed since the Zephyrian Empire destroyed every human colony in the Outer Rim systems. Earth's once proud fleet was nothing but floating metal and dead bodies scattered across a dozen different worlds. The Defiance was the last hope humanity had left. Built in secret during the final days of the war, this ship was different from anything the galaxy had ever seen. While other races followed the same boring designs that had worked for thousands of years, humans did things their own way. They took risks that made alien engineers shake their heads in disbelief. Engineer Lisa Carter had spent 3 years building the quantum cascade drive that powered their ship. The technology was so new that most human scientists thought it was impossible. Lisa worked 18 hours every day in the engine room, testing and fixing parts that had never been used before. Her hands were always covered in grease, and her uniform was torn in 6 different places. But she never complained about the work. Weapons Officer Ryan Blake sat at his control station and ran diagnostics on their experimental cannon systems. The quantum resonance weapons could punch holes through enemy shields like they were made of paper. Ryan had designed the targeting computers himself, writing code that could process battle data faster than any alien computer system in the known galaxy. The bridge was quiet except for the soft humming of the ship's engines. Navigation Officer Kelly Price checked their course for the 10th time in an hour. Her fingers moved across the control panel with practiced skill as she calculated jump coordinates and fuel consumption rates. Kelly had been flying ships since she was 16 years old, and she knew space better than most people knew their own homes. Communications. Specialist Danny Rodriguez monitored enemy transmissions from his workstation. The Zephyrians were not trying to hide their conversations, probably because they thought no humans were left alive to listen. Danny spoke 4 alien languages fluently and could understand 6 more well enough to get the important details. What he heard made his blood run cold. Admiral Vexstar was coming with his personal fleet. The alien commander led the most feared military force in the galaxy, 200 massive dreadnoughts that had never lost a single battle. Intelligence reports said Vexstar planned to hunt down every remaining human survivor and kill them slowly. For the entertainment of his crew, Jake Morrison had been captain of the Defiance for only 6 months, but he felt like he had aged 10 years during that time. The weight of being humanity's last defender pressed down on his shoulders every waking moment. He was 34 years old and had originally signed up to explore new worlds and make contact with friendly alien races. Instead, he found himself preparing for a fight that would decide if humans continued to exist. The crew of 73 men and women aboard the Defiance represented every branch of human military service. They came from Earth, Mars, the Jupiter colonies, and Frontier, settlements that no longer existed. Some had families who died in the first Zephyrian attacks, while others had volunteered for this mission, knowing they would never see home again. Dr. Susan Walsh worked in the science lab, making final adjustments to their experimental weapon systems. The quantum resonance cannons operated on principles that violated several established laws of physics. Human scientists had discovered the technology by accident while trying to solve completely different problems. Susan had to rewrite physics textbooks just to understand how their own weapons worked. The ship's corridors were narrow and cramped compared to the spacious alien vessels they had encountered. Humans built their ships for efficiency rather than comfort, cramming as much equipment and weapons into the smallest possible space. Every inch of the Defiance served a purpose, from the extra armor plating to the backup power systems hidden behind wall panels. Lieutenant Nathan Cross checked the helm controls one more time. The navigation system was connected directly to his neural implant, allowing him to pilot the ship with thought commands faster and manual controls would allow. Nathan had volunteered for the experimental procedure, even though doctors warned him about possible brain damage. Flying the Defiance required reflexes that no normal human could match. Chief Gunner Maria Santos ran her hands over the weapon control panel like a pianist preparing for a concert. Each button and switch controlled enough firepower to level a level city, but Maria treated them with gentle care. She had grown up on a farming world where her family taught her to respect the tools that kept them alive. Now she was responsible for weapons that might keep humanity alive. Long-range sensors detected movement at the edge of their patrol zone. The Zephyrian fleet was coming exactly where intelligence reports had predicted they would appear. Jake Morrison felt his heart beat faster as he realized their moment of truth had finally arrived. Everything they had trained for, everything they had sacrificed, would be decided in the next few hours. The enemy ships began dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 200 vessels that looked like giant metal insects emerged from the darkness of space. Each dreadnought was over 2 kilometers long and carried enough weapons to destroy an entire planet. The Zephyrian Empire had sent their best to finish off the last free humans in the galaxy. Admiral Vextar's flagship appeared in the center of the enemy formation, like a queen surrounded by her deadly children. The Sovereign Terror was 3 kilometers of pure destruction, a ship that had conquered 47 different star systems without taking significant damage. Zephyrian military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and absolute victory, which explained why they had brought such a massive fleet to hunt down one. Human vessel. Jake Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These people had volunteered to die for an idea that most of the galaxy thought was worthless. Humans believed in freedom, in the right to make their own choices and live their own lives. The Zephyrian Empire wanted to control every world, every species, every individual thought in the known universe. The communication system crackled to life as Admiral Vextar's voice filled the bridge. The alien commander spoke in perfect English, his words carefully chosen to cause maximum psychological damage. He offered the humans a quick death if they surrendered immediately, promising to make their end merciful compared to what had happened to their colonies. Jake Morrison stood up from his captain's chair and walked to the main screen. The enemy fleet stretched across space like a wall of death, their weapons already charging for the coming battle. He thought about Earth, about the billions of people who had trusted him to protect them. He thought about the children who would never grow up if he failed here today. The captain opened a channel to respond to the Zephyrian Admiral's surrender demand. His answer was only 2 words long, but those words carried the weight of an entire species' refusal to kneel before tyranny. Jake Morrison looked directly at the enemy flagship on his screen and spoke with calm determination that surprised even his own crew. The Zephyrian fleet spread across space like a swarm of metal predators hungry for blood. 200 dreadnoughts moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. Each ship was a masterpiece of alien engineering, built to inspire fear in anyone foolish enough to oppose the Galactic Empire. Their weapons were already charging, creating an eerie blue glow that painted the darkness with the promise of destruction. Admiral Vextar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Sovereign Terror, and watched the tiny human vessel through his tactical display. The alien commander was 7 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished black stone. His species had conquered 17 different galaxies over the past 1,000 years, and he had personally led the destruction of 47 star systems that dared to resist imperial rule. The human ship looked pathetic compared to his massive fleet. The Defiance was less than 800 meters long, barely large enough to qualify as a light cruiser by Zephyrian standards. Its hull was scarred from previous battles and patched with mismatched metal plates that showed how desperate the humans had become. Vextar had seen cargo ships that looked more threatening than this last remnant of human military power. Commander Alex Turner studied the enemy formation from his tactical station aboard the Defiance. The Zephyrians had arranged themselves in a classic encirclement pattern designed to prevent escape while bringing maximum firepower to bear on their target. It was the same formation they had used to destroy the human colonies, a proven strategy that had never failed them in 3 centuries of warfare. Alex had spent years studying alien military tactics, learning how different species approached combat and command structures. The Zephyrians were methodical and predictable, following ancient battle plans that had worked for so long they never bothered to change them. Their commanders were trained to overwhelm enemies with superior numbers and firepower, not to adapt to unexpected situations. Dr. Susan Walsh made final adjustments to the quantum resonance cannon array from her science station. The experimental weapons were based on technology that human scientists barely understood themselves. They had discovered the principles by accident while trying to create better communication systems, stumbling onto a way to manipulate the basic forces that held matter together. The weapons worked by creating tiny rifts in space-time that allowed raw energy from parallel dimensions to pour through into normal reality. The process violated at least 6 known laws of physics, and probably several more that hadn't been discovered yet. Susan had run thousands of computer simulations, but she still wasn't completely sure what would happen when they fired the cannons. At full power, Lieutenant Commander Helen Ross monitored their defensive systems from her engineering console. The Defiance was equipped with adaptive shielding technology that could analyze incoming attacks and automatically adjust to provide maximum protection. Instead of simply absorbing enemy fire like traditional shields, the human barriers learned from each hit and became stronger. Against similar weapons, the technology required massive amounts of computing power and energy, which was why no other species had ever developed anything like it. Human computer systems were different from alien designs, built to handle chaotic data patterns rather than following predetermined logical structures. This gave them the flexibility to solve problems that would crash conventional computers. Admiral Vextar opened a communication channel to the human ship, expecting immediate surrender when faced with such overwhelming odds. His translator converted his words into the crude human language, though he doubted these primitives would understand the honor he was offering them. A quick death was more mercy than his species usually showed to defeated enemies. Captain Jake Morrison listened to the alien commander's demands without showing any emotion on his face. The Zephyrian offered to execute his crew quickly if they surrendered now, promising to make their deaths less painful than what had happened to the human colonies. Vextar described in graphic detail how he had tortured the survivors of previous battles for the entertainment of his officers. The human captain looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These 73 men and women represented the last free humans in the galaxy, the final members of a species that refused to kneel before tyranny. They had volunteered for this mission, knowing they would probably die, but believing their sacrifice might inspire others to continue fighting for freedom. Danny Rodriguez intercepted communications between the Zephyrian ships as they prepared for battle. The alien commanders were discussing how to divide the spoils after their victory, arguing about who would get to keep pieces of the human ship as trophies. They talked about the humans like they were already dead, making jokes about how easy this battle would be compared to their previous conquests. Chief Engineer Lisa Carter ran diagnostics on the quantum cascade drive one final time. The experimental propulsion system could bend space around their ship, allowing them to appear in multiple locations simultaneously for brief periods. The technology put enormous stress on the ship's hull and would probably tear the Defiance apart if they used it too much, but it might give them the edge they needed to survive. Navigation Officer Kelly Price calculated attack vectors and escape Roots, though she knew there was nowhere to run, even if they wanted to. The Zephyrian fleet had positioned itself to block every possible exit from this section of space. The only way out was through 200 enemy dreadnoughts, armed with enough firepower to sterilize planets. Weapons. Officer Ryan Blake targeted the enemy flagship with their primary weapons array. The quantum resonance cannons were designed to overload enemy shields and tear holes in the strongest armor ever created. He had modified the targeting computers to predict Zephyrian movement, patterns based on their cultural preferences rather than pure tactical analysis. The aliens valued honor and hierarchy above survival, which created exploitable weaknesses in their command structure. If he could eliminate key flagship vessels, it might trigger cascading failures throughout their chain of command. The Zephyrians had never learned to function without clear leadership, because their society had never faced a situation where improvisation was necessary. Admiral Vex Star waited for the human response to his generous offer of quick execution. He expected groveling and pleading, perhaps an attempt to bargain for better terms. Instead, the communication channel crackled to life with just 2 words that would echo through galactic history for centuries to come. Captain. Jake Morrison looked directly at the main screen, showing the enemy flagship, and spoke with quiet determination. That surprised even his own crew. His response was simple, direct, and carried the weight of an entire species' refusal to surrender to tyranny. Those 2 words would become the battle cry of resistance movements across the galaxy. The Zephyrian Admiral stared at his communication console in disbelief. No species had ever responded to his surrender demands with such casual defiance. He had expected fear, desperation, maybe even anger, but not this calm rejection of what he considered a merciful offer. The human captain had just signed the death warrant for his entire crew. The battle began with the Defiance charging straight into the heart of the Zephyrian formation, like a missile aimed at certain death. Lieutenant Nathan Cross pushed the ship's engines beyond their safety limits, feeling the neural connection. Between his brain and the helm, controls burned like fire inside his skull. The human vessel accelerated to speeds that should have torn it apart, defying every law of physics that alien engineers thought they understood. Admiral Vex Star watched in confusion as the tiny human ship ignored all logical tactical doctrine. No sane commander would attack 200 dreadnoughts head-on with a single vessel, especially one that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts and desperate hope. The alien admiral had studied human military history and knew they were capable of surprising strategies. But this seemed like pure suicide. The first Zephyrian ships opened fire when the Defiance came within range of their energy cannons. Brilliant. Beams of concentrated plasma streaked across space, enough firepower to vaporize an entire city in seconds. The human ship twisted and rolled through the incoming barrage like a dancer performing an impossible ballet, its hull coming within meters of destruction. Dozens of times. Nathan Cross felt his consciousness expand as the neural implant connected him more deeply to the ship's navigation systems. He could sense every bolt and rivet in the Defiance's hull, feel the stress patterns in the metal as gravitational forces tried to tear the vessel apart. His human brain processed spatial relationships in ways that alien computers couldn't match, finding safe paths through the deadly energy web that surrounded them. Chief Gunner Maria Santos waited for the perfect moment to return fire. Her fingers hovered over the weapon controls as targeting data flowed across her screens in streams of numbers that changed faster than most people could read. The quantum resonance cannons were charged and ready, but she needed to be absolutely certain of her first shots because there might not be time for a second chance. The Defiance rolled inverted and dove beneath the Zephyrian formation, passing so close to one dreadnought that their hulls almost touched. Nathan pulled the ship through a spiraling climb that brought them up behind a cluster of enemy vessels, their weapons suddenly pointed and unshielded. engine sections that glowed with vulnerable heat signatures. Maria pressed the firing controls and watched their experimental weapons unleash hell upon the galaxy's most feared fleet. The quantum resonance beams tore through space like invisible claws, hitting the first Zephyrian dreadnought exactly where its shields were weakest. The alien vessel's defensive barriers collapsed instantly, overloaded by energy patterns they had no ability to understand or resist. The beam punched through 3 kilometers of armored hull like a hot knife cutting through butter. Internal explosions rippled through the enemy ship as critical systems overloaded and power cores went critical. The massive dreadnought broke apart in a chain reaction of secondary explosions that lit up the darkness with expanding clouds of superheated plasma and twisted metal. Admiral Vextar stared at his tactical display in disbelief as one of his most powerful ships simply ceased to exist. The weapons readings made no sense according to everything his science officers knew about energy physics. The human beam had somehow bypassed their shields entirely, as if the defensive barriers had never been there at all. The Defiance rolled away from the expanding debris field and immediately engaged 3 more Zephyrian vessels. Maria fired the quantum cannons as fast as the charging systems would allow, each shot finding its target with precision that seemed impossible at such close range. Enemy dreadnoughts exploded one after another, their proud hulls turned into expanding spheres of glowing gas. Dr. Susan Walsh monitored the weapon systems from her science station, watching energy readings that climbed into ranges her instruments had never been designed to measure. The quantum rifts were holding stable for now, but she could see stress patterns building in the dimensional barriers that kept their experimental technology from tearing holes in reality itself. The Zephyrian fleet tried to close ranks and bring their superior numbers to bear, but the human ship moved through their formation like water flowing around rocks. Nathan Cross used the quantum cascade drive to make microjumps that lasted only seconds, appearing behind enemy vessels before they could react to his new position. Lieutenant Commander Helen Ross watched their adaptive shields absorb incoming fire and learn from each attack. The defensive systems analyzed the energy patterns of Zephyrian weapons and automatically adjusted their harmonic frequencies to provide maximum protection. Plasma beams that should have melted their hull were deflected harmlessly into space. Commander Alex Turner coordinated their attack patterns from his tactical station, identifying weaknesses in the enemy formation before the Zephyrians themselves realized they existed. He had studied their command structure and knew exactly which ships to target first. By eliminating key vessels in the proper sequence, he could create cascading failures throughout their entire fleet. Defiance spun through a series of impossible maneuvers that brought them alongside Admiral Vextar's flagship, the Sovereign. Terror was 3 times their size and armed with enough weapons to level continents. But Maria Santos had identified a structural weakness in the massive vessel's design. The quantum cannons fired simultaneously, focusing their combined output on a single point. The beams struck the flagship's primary shield generator and overloaded it instantly. Secondary explosions rippled on the Sovereign, Terror's hull, as backup systems tried to compensate for the sudden power surge. Sparks and flames erupted from damaged sections as the pride of the Zephyrian fleet found itself vulnerable for the first time in its combat history. Admiral Vextar felt his ship shudder under the impact of weapons that his science officers insisted were impossible. Emergency lights flashed throughout the bridge as damage reports flooded in from every section. The humans had somehow neutralized their strongest shields with a single coordinated attack, leaving his flagship exposed to further assault. The alien commander ordered his entire fleet to converge on the human vessel, abandoning all tactical formations in favor of overwhelming firepower. 200 dreadnoughts turned their weapons toward the Defiance, creating a storm of energy beams that filled the surrounding space with deadly radiation. Nathan Cross felt the ship respond to his thoughts as he guided them through the lethal maze of incoming fire. His neural implant burned with the effort of processing so much spatial data simultaneously, but he held the connection steady, even as blood began to trickle from his nose. The Defiance danced between death rays, like a ghost it refused to be. Caught, Chief Engineer Lisa Carter watched their power levels fluctuate wildly as the quantum cascade drive pushed their reactor beyond its design specifications. Warning alarms screamed throughout the engine room as temperatures climbed toward critical levels, but the experimental propulsion system continued to function. Despite operating in conditions that should have destroyed it, the battle had lasted only minutes, but already a dozen Zephyrian dreadnoughts had been reduced to glowing debris. The survivors were beginning to realize that their overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing against an enemy that could appear anywhere and strike, with weapons that ignored their most advanced defenses. Admiral Vexstar watched in growing horror as his invincible fleet began to crumble around him like a sandcastle hit by ocean waves. 50 of his finest dreadnoughts had been reduced to glowing wreckage in less than 20 minutes of combat. Ships that had conquered entire star systems were being destroyed by a single human vessel that moved through space like it was dancing with death itself. The alien commander's 4 hands trembled as he gripped the command console, his black stone skin turning pale gray with fear he had never experienced before. For 3 centuries, the Zephyrian Empire had ruled the galaxy through overwhelming military superiority. Their fleets had never retreated from battle, their weapons had never failed to destroy any target, and their enemies had never survived long enough to learn from their mistakes. Captain Jake Morrison felt the weight of humanity's future pressing down on his shoulders as he watched the tactical display show their impossible victory taking shape. The Defiance had already exceeded every prediction their strategists had made about the battle's outcome. They were not just surviving against overwhelming odds, they were winning in a way that would change galactic history forever. The remaining Zephyrian ships began to break formation as panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Captains who had never known defeat found themselves ordering full retreats without authorization from their commanding officers. The rigid military hierarchy that had made the Empire so effective was now working against them as lower-ranking commanders waited for orders that never came. Chief Engineer Lisa Carter pushed the quantum cascade drive to its absolute limits, knowing that each microjump brought them closer to a catastrophic system failure. The experimental technology was tearing microscopic holes in the fabric of spacetime, creating dimensional rifts that leaked exotic energy into their engine compartments. Her instruments showed readings that should have been impossible, but somehow the drive continued to function. Lieutenant Nathan Cross felt blood streaming from his nose as the neural interface burned pathways through his brain that human anatomy was never designed to handle. The connection between his consciousness and the ship's navigation systems had become so complete that he could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the Defiance's computer began. He was becoming something more than human, and the transformation was killing him slowly. Dr. Susan Walsh monitored the quantum resonance cannons as they fired volley after volley into the enemy formation. Each shot created tiny tears in reality that allowed raw energy from parallel dimensions to pour through into normal space. The weapons were consuming so much power that she had to reroute energy from life support systems just to keep them charged and ready. The Zephyrian fleet tried desperately to adapt their tactics to counter the human vessel's impossible maneuvers. They formed defensive clusters and overlapping fire zones, but the Defiance simply appeared in different locations, faster than their targeting computers could track. The alien weapons were designed to fight enemies that followed predictable movement patterns, not ships that could bend the laws of physics. Commander Alex Turner studied the enemy formation and identified the key vessels that were trying to coordinate a counterattack. The Zephyrians were still following their ancient command protocols, which made their behavior predictable to anyone who understood their military culture. He targeted the communication ships first, cutting off the fleet's ability to coordinate their movements. Chief Gunner Maria Santos felt like she was conducting a symphony of destruction as her fingers danced across the weapon controls. The quantum cannons responded to her commands with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed to create maximum chaos in the enemy ranks. She had learned to predict where the Zephyrian ships would be seconds before they arrived, turning their own tactical predictability against them. Admiral Vextar realized that his fleet was facing complete annihilation if he didn't change tactics. Immediately, he ordered his remaining ships to scatter across the battlefield, hoping to force the humans to chase individual targets instead of destroying entire formations with single attacks. The decision went against every military tradition his species had followed for millennia, but desperation had finally overcome pride. The Defiance pursued the fleeing Zephyrian vessels with relentless efficiency, hunting them down one by one like a predator that had tasted blood. Nathan Cross pushed the ship through maneuvers that should have liquefied every person aboard, but their inertial dampeners somehow managed to keep the crew alive despite forces that exceeded their design specifications by orders of magnitude. Lieutenant Commander Helen Ross watched their adaptive shields evolve in real time as they absorbed different types of enemy fire. The defensive systems had learned to recognize Zephyrian weapon signatures and automatically adjusted their frequencies to provide maximum protection. Energy beams that had torn through the strongest alien armor were now being deflected harmlessly into empty space. Communications Specialist Danny Rodriguez intercepted desperate transmissions between the surviving enemy ships. Zephyrian captains were screaming for reinforcements, begging for permission to retreat, and questioning the competence of their commanding officers. The disciplined military formation that had entered the battle was degenerating into a mob of terrified individuals who only wanted to escape with their lives. The quantum cascade drive allowed the Defiance to split its presence across multiple dimensional phases, creating the illusion that several human ships were attacking from different directions simultaneously. Captain Morrison found his consciousness expanding to control these phantom vessels, coordinating attacks from positions that existed in overlapping realities. Dr. Susan Walsh watched her instruments register energy patterns that violated everything she thought she knew about physics. The quantum rifts were becoming more stable as the battle progressed, as if the repeated use of the technology was teaching the universe new rules about how energy and matter could interact. She was witnessing the birth of an entirely new branch of science. The Zephyrian fleet that had entered the battle with arrogant confidence was now reduced to less than 80 ships, and those survivors were scattered across several light years of space. Admiral Vextar's flagship, the Sovereign Terror, limped through the darkness with half its weapons offline and its proud hull scarred by human weapons that shouldn't have existed. Weapons Officer Ryan Blake modified their targeting algorithms to predict Zephyrian behavior based on psychological profiles rather than tactical doctrine. He understood that fear was now driving their enemies' decisions, and terrified beings made different choices than confident warriors. By exploiting their panic, he could force them into traps that would eliminate entire squadrons with minimal ammunition expenditure. Medical Officer Andrew Parker treated the few crew members who had been injured by the extreme gravitational forces generated during their impossible maneuvers. Human physiology was being pushed beyond its theoretical limits, but somehow they continued to function at levels that alien medical science would have considered impossible. The battle was entering its final phase, and everyone aboard the Defiance knew that the next few minutes would determine whether humanity survived or joined the countless species that had fallen before Zephyrian might. Captain Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew and saw determination that burned, brighter than the stars themselves. The Sovereign Terror drifted through space like a wounded beast, its massive hull scarred and broken from weapons that should never have existed. Admiral Vexstar stood alone on his command bridge as emergency lights cast eerie shadows across. Walls that had once symbolized the unstoppable might of the Zephyrian Empire. His proud fleet of 200 dreadnoughts had been reduced to fewer than 20 ships, and those survivors were scattered across the battlefield like leaves blown by a hurricane. Captain Jake Morrison watched the enemy flagship through the main screen of the Defiance, knowing that this final confrontation would determine the fate of every free being in the galaxy. The human ship had sustained heavy damage during the impossible battle, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and systems running on backup power. Smoke filled several compartments, and the smell of burning electronics reminded everyone that their victory had come at a terrible cost. The quantum cascade drive was operating far beyond its design specifications, creating dimensional rifts that leaked exotic energy into normal space with increasing frequency. Chief Engineer Lisa Carter worked frantically to keep the experimental propulsion system stable, knowing that a catastrophic failure would tear the Defiance apart from the inside. Her hands were burned from touching superheated components, but she refused to leave her post while humanity's survival hung in the balance. Lieutenant Nathan Cross felt his consciousness fragmenting as the neural interface pushed his human brain beyond its biological limits. Blood ran from his eyes and ears, as the connection between his mind and the ship's navigation systems became so complete that he was no longer entirely human. He could feel every rivet and circuit in the Defiance's hull, sense the quantum currents flowing through dimensions that normal people couldn't even imagine. Admiral Vexstar opened a final communication channel to the human vessel, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and grudging respect that his species had never felt for any enemy. He acknowledged that the humans had achieved something impossible, destroying the galaxy's most powerful fleet with a single ship that looked like it had been built from spare parts and desperate hope. The alien commander offered Captain Morrison a proposal that went against every military tradition of the Zephyrian Empire. Instead of fighting to the death as honor demanded, Vexstar suggested single combat between their two flagships. If the humans won, the surviving Zephyrian vessels would retreat and never return to human space. If the Sovereign Terror emerged victorious, the Defiance would surrender and accept immediate execution for its crew. Jake Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his 73 crew members, seeing exhaustion and determination in equal measure. These people had volunteered to sacrifice everything for the chance to strike back against tyranny, and their impossible victory had already exceeded every hope they had dared to express. The captain opened a channel to respond to the alien Admiral's challenge with words that would echo through galactic history. The Defiance accelerated toward the fort, Sovereign Terror with engines that screamed in protest against forces that should have torn the ship apart. Nathan Cross guided their approach through pure instinct, his enhanced consciousness processing spatial relationships that no computer could calculate fast enough. The two vessels closed the distance between them like ancient warriors advancing for a final duel that would decide the outcome of an entire war. Gunner Maria Santos prepared their remaining weapons for the ultimate test of human engineering against alien superiority. The quantum resonance cannons were charged to maximum power, but she knew they had enough energy for only a few more shots before the experimental technology failed completely. Every beam would have to count, because there would be no second chances in this final confrontation. The Sovereign Terror opened fire with every functional weapon in its arsenal, creating a storm of energy that lit up the surrounding space with deadly rainbow colors. Plasma beams and particle cannons converged on the Defiance from dozens of different angles, enough firepower to sterilize an entire planet in seconds. The human ship rolled and twisted through the lethal barrage, like a dancer performing an impossible ballet with death. Lieutenant Commander. Helen Ross watched their adaptive shields absorb punishment that should have vaporized any vessel ever built. The defensive systems had evolved far beyond their original programming, learning to predict enemy attacks before they were even fired. Energy patterns that had destroyed Zephyrian dreadnoughts were deflected harmlessly into empty space by barriers that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Dr. Susan Walsh monitored the quantum rifts as they began to destabilize under the massive energy loads required for their final attack. The dimensional barriers that kept their experimental technology from tearing holes in reality were beginning to collapse, threatening to unleash forces that could destroy both ships and everything else within several light years. She had to time their assault perfectly, or risked creating a catastrophe that would be visible from neighboring star systems. The Defiance rolled inverted and dove beneath the Sovereign Terror's firing arcs, bringing their quantum cannons to bear on the enemy flagship's most vulnerable sections. Maria Santos waited until the targeting computers achieved perfect lock-on before pressing the firing controls that would determine humanity's future. The experimental weapons discharged simultaneously, focusing their combined output on a single point that represented 3 centuries of Zephyrian military pride. That quantum beams struck the flagship's command section with energy patterns that the alien ship's designers had never imagined possible. Dimensional rifts tore through the Sovereign Terror's hull like invisible claws, allowing raw power from parallel universes to flood into normal space. The massive vessel convulsed as internal explosions rippled through every deck, its proud structure failing under forces that exceeded every known law of physics. Admiral Vextar felt his ship dying around him as systems that had never failed began to shut down one by one. The human weapons had somehow reached through dimensions to strike at the very foundations of matter itself, unmaking the atomic bonds that held his flagship together. He transmitted a final message acknowledging the impossible victory of beings he had once considered primitive savages. The Sovereign Terror broke apart in a chain reaction of secondary explosions that created a new star in the darkness of space. The destruction of the Zephyrian Empire's most feared vessel sent shockwaves through the surviving enemy ships, causing their crews to abandon all thoughts of continued resistance. The few remaining dreadnoughts activated their hyperspace drives and fled toward distant galaxies where news of this defeat might never reach. Captain Morrison transmitted a message to the hidden human colonies scattered across the Outer Rim, informing them that the path to Earth was finally clear. The Defiance had achieved the impossible, breaking the military might that had held an entire galaxy in chains for 3 centuries. Humanity was free to reclaim their homeworld and rebuild their civilization among the stars. The crew of the Defiance had become legends, whose names would be spoken with reverence by every species that valued freedom over tyranny. They had proven that courage and determination could overcome any technological advantage, establishing humanity as a force that no empire could afford to underestimate. Their victory marked the beginning of a new age in which no being would ever again kneel before the threat of galactic conquest.